Now, for tonight, I'm going to introduce you to your host. She's an award-winning writer and editor in Toronto with a weekly column on politics, pop culture, and feminism that appears in Chatelaine, where she is the editor-at-large. She was the deputy editor of The Grid, a senior editor at The Walrus, and she is still a regular contributor to CBC Radio. Her own book is coming out in 2017 with HarperCollins. Please help me welcome to the stage Rachel Gisa.
So please help me welcome Elan Mastai to the stage. So your idealized 2016, the idealized 2016 in the book, I know that you've said this is actually a 1950s idea of what our present would be like.
Yeah.
So can you talk about what you drew on to create this 2016 utopia?
Yeah, absolutely. And before I do that, I just want to say thank you all for coming. This is my first book, and I know that I'm sure a lot of people haven't read it because it just came out. So I just want to say this is lovely, and it means a lot to me, and so thank you. Thank you also to the Appel Salon for inviting me to be here at the amazing Toronto Reference Library. Yesterday was Margaret Atwood, and like in 2 days it's Paul Auster. So like anyways, it's a nice crowd to be in. I appreciate it. Yeah, so when I was growing up, my grandfather was a chemist. He had this extensive collection of vintage science fiction from the 50s and 60s, and I was just really, I loved that stuff. I loved, and it was all pulp sci-fi, right? Like it literally wasn't supposed to last. So I loved peeling the kind of like old, brittle, books and magazines off the shelf and lying on the living room rug, and particularly the covers with these kind of like fantastic images of like futuristic cities and robots and bases on the moon. And but even as a kid in the 80s, I was aware that it wasn't turning out the way they thought it would, and I think that kind of came to a head for me. I grew up in Vancouver, and Expo '86 was a really big thing in Vancouver. And Expo '86 was a World's Fair, like the sort of famous World Fairs of like New York in '64, Expo '67 in Montreal was a World's Fair. This kind of techno-utopian vision of the future in which technology would solve all of our problems. It's only recently that I discovered that Expo '86 was actually the last World's Fair ever hosted in North America. We kind of stopped hosting them. We stopped dreaming of the future in that way. But it had a big impact on me as a kid. And the idea of being able to write a novel set now, at least partially set now, but in that version of the world, was very appealing. But then, of course, to thrust, like you said, my protagonist into our version of the world and what it would be, what somebody who came from that, that idea of this sort of like amazing future where technology has solved all of our problems to land here. It's a chance in that kind of Kurt Vonnegut way to look at our world with fresh eyes and see what it would seem like to somebody from there.
Well, it's interesting because I think that the image of the future from the 50s said more about the 50s, obviously, than, it was sort of, it was full of that post-war optimism, booming economies, a sense forward. And I think, when you think about how someone might project from this particular moment, what do you think the current sci-fi?
Well, our visions of the future are always just about the present. And that was something that for those who haven't read the book, like without taking too much away from the journey.
Well, maybe you can describe what the 2016, give some more details of the utopian 2016 of the book is.
It's a version of the world, I wanted to play off the kind of tropes of the time, the flying cars and the teleportation and the moving sidewalks and robot maids to clean up after you, and, your food is like a nutrient gel that just sort of squirts out in the shape of whatever you want it to, but it tastes perfect every time. And I like... But part of what I was doing was playing with those ideas of the sort of this world where technology has is so accelerated and has solved all of the sort of mundane, both the sort of mundane human things, but also like the big picture war and poverty and crime. At the same time, I wanted it to be very much a utopia as imagined by people like in the 50s and 60s. And so it's also inherently very consumerist. There's a certain kind of like a social and gender and cultural equality that comes with radical consumerism because if you're a paying customer, everybody's equal.
Yeah.
But at the same time, there are certain, I think as you read the book, like, there are certain little things you notice which are different than our version of the world. And for the protagonist, who comes from that world and also comes ideologically from that world, it's only when he gets here, at first he's horrified, but then he starts to notice things about our version of the world that are appealing to him, things that he didn't even realize he was missing in his version of the world. Because when technology will solve a lot of your problems, you don't have to worry about taking responsibility for your actions in the same way. And you maybe don't notice certain social dysfunctions because life is very easy.
Yeah.
You know, most of the time we only notice social issues when things are going wrong.
Well, and I think it's why, you know, in some ways, I wonder if writing a utopia is a little bit harder than writing a dystopia, because with a dystopia there's a built-in tension. I mean,
I just go on Twitter and it's very easy to describe it. It's very simple, yeah.
But I was thinking about this because when you mentioned that Margaret Atwood had been here the other night, I had just reread The Handmaid's Tale, which is now being made into a Hulu series, and she wrote it in the 80s, and it reflects a lot of the conservative Reagan era 80s, the sort of the Cold War, the AIDS crisis. It reflects that moment, and it is very much the tension is built in when you have this terrible, terrible dystopia. In a way, I think it's harder to find friction in a utopia.
Yeah, and that is, you know, part of what the protagonist is going through. I mean, he comes from a world where, because most things are taken care of, it's actually in some ways harder to find your place.
Yeah.
You know, because you don't have to take responsibility in the same way that you do. Here, all his actions have consequences. There literally is no robot maid that is going to clean up your messes. You have to clean them up yourself.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, what happens to the protagonist, and we will avoid spoilers for those who haven't read it, but he ends up going through a sort of a through the use of a stolen time machine, going back into this alternate 2016. So if something hadn't happened at a particular moment in time, this would have been how the world turned.
Yeah, he goes back to 1965 and causes an accident that has ramifications for the timeline.
Which is the very thing you're not supposed to do when you go back in time.
I mean, in his defense, in his version of 2016, there aren't a lot of time travel movies. Like, Back to the Future wasn't made in that, so he doesn't have that idea. You know, it's like that. You know, one of my pet peeves of zombie movies, where like nobody in a zombie movie has ever seen a zombie movie. It's like, what are these strange, mindless creatures that are shuffling around trying to eat our brains? If only there was a word for that. Anyways, yeah, I mean, I like the idea of going back. I mean, I think, you know, this idea of like a hinge moment. I think for a lot of us, we have these hinge moments in our lives, and I spent a lot of time thinking about like when could he go back to, like, and I chose 1965 because it did feel to me like. I mean, I'm sure if you were there, you would have a different sense of it. But from the perspective of now, it felt like a time where you know, when we talk about the 60s, we usually mean the late 60s. You know, there was a sense of like the early 60s being a little more akin to that sort of 1950s kind of post-war generational sensibility. Things started to take a turn. It's basically the Beatles' fault. But I felt like 65 was a really good time to focus on when things could have kind of gone in different directions. You know, the Civil Rights Act in the U.S. had just passed. The war in Vietnam was ramping up. I mean, obviously Kennedy had been assassinated. The U.S. was heavily invested in the space race against Russia, and it just felt like a time when the sort of you know, when the more sort of dewy-eyed optimism of what we could achieve, which did kind of come out of both sort of coming out of the horrors of World War II, but also the prosperity and sometimes complacency of the sort of suburban expansion of the 50s. I sounded like I knew what I was talking about for a minute there.
No, you did. It was really effective.
And I chose 1965 because it felt like a moment where things started to kind of wobble and sway into a different direction, and things started to get increasingly cynical at first, anti-authoritarian, skeptical, and then increasingly dystopian in the way people started to imagine the future. And I think a lot of it actually comes down to our awareness of, you know, what falls under the rubric of like environmentalism, you know, as I think the consequences of our technology, our civilization on the planet started to become increasingly undeniable, that optimistic perspective on the future did start to curdle.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you about the way that you handled the technology of time travel in the book, because I know that it was really important for you to get the science right.
Right.
So can you talk a bit, I mean, is there actually a body of science that looks at time travel, and if it were feasible, what would actually happen? Like, who do you go to for that kind of research? Who's the guy?
Yeah, I mean, it was weird. He's outside on a milk carton, just screaming at people as he goes by. I mean, he has like 3 PhDs, but he keeps them in his pocket. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of research you can do. There's a lot of people that have obviously theorized that kind of attempt to take practical physics and engineering and apply them to time travel. I mean, for me, and this kind of ties back to my grandfather, who was a chemist, was a trained scientist, and he loved science fiction. He's the one who introduced me to it. But he used to grumble that all these sci-fi stories, they don't even try to get the science right.
Yeah.
And that the science is fascinating, and if you actually spend some time kind of digging into it, it would actually make it not just more realistic, but also more interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I decided to kind of take a swing at evoking the sort of classic sci-fi in a modern context that he introduced me to, I was like, I got to try to take the science seriously. But also part of that was this utopian version of the world that I kind of concoct for the first part of the book. It's very much a science-driven society. It's a place where science has kind of taken the place of religion, or it's sort of the dominant ideology of scientific
And science
discovery.
is fundamentally good.
Yeah, in that perspective, because in that version of the world, it has worked
Solve
out.
problems,
And so, yeah, I mean, one of the things that I was always, and some of this stuff is just like you have these little pet peeves, and then when you take a crack at it as a writer, you try to address it and see if you can come up with something better. So one of my pet peeves is that I'd never really read a time travel story that factors in the fact that the Earth is constantly moving. Most time travel stories act like we'll just open a door and we'll walk through the past and we'll be right back in this same room. But of course, we all know that the Earth is spinning at up to 1,000 miles an hour on its axis. It's revolving around the sun at 67,000 miles an hour. The sun is moving through the galaxy at about 1,300,000 miles an hour. So we feel like we're not moving. Your legs may be falling asleep because you've been sitting here already for so long, but we're actually hurtling through space at unimaginable speeds. And any model of time travel that doesn't address astrodynamics and orbital mechanics is just kind of ignoring the reality of the situation. Now, it's fine, Harry Potter, Time Turner, it's fun. I'm not trying to say that was a really good book. But
that was like a complete subtweet of J.K. Rowling right there.
But I wanted to see if I tried to take. And again, don't worry. It's not like I piled a ton of quantum physics into the book at all.
Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to think about it for myself. If I could think of a way of modeling time travel that would actually take into consideration orbital mechanics and the rotation of the planet, what would that look like? And as my grandfather had sort of said all those years ago, it opened up all these storytelling possibilities that I wouldn't necessarily have otherwise thought about.
Mm-hmm.
And it also got me just thinking about time. I mean, we think about time as this sort of we're relentlessly being propelled forward 1 second at a time. There's no way to turn back the clock. It's a great human fantasy, but we're just, we're relentlessly being pulled forward. But we do think of ourselves as not moving in space, or that we have some sort of agency in space.
Yeah.
We can get up, we can walk around. You could all leave right now and go downstairs. In fact, that's fine. But like I said, that's about the limitations of human perception. We're actually hurtling through space at unimaginable speeds. And so I find sometimes thinking about that kind of thing, it's just a good kind of perspective shift.
Yeah. There was, when I was reading the book and then preparing for tonight, I remembered this episode of This American Life from 2014, and they talked about a study from Pew and the Smithsonian, where they spoke to a bunch of Americans and they asked them about what future technologies did they want and what did they expect would happen. And 1 in 10, which was the highest number, said they wanted a time machine. So that was the number one pick. More than world peace, more than robot servants, more than jetpacks. People wanted a time machine. That was the thing they wanted to see happening in the future. But what was interesting is that when they surveyed people, almost no one wanted to go to the future.
Right.
Everyone wanted to go to the past. Does that surprise you? I mean, as someone who's thought a lot about time travel, does it surprise you that people would want to go back instead of going forward?
No, because it's an essential human desire to revisit the past, whether it's to make a different decision, to change mistakes or what we perceive as mistakes, to kind of to face our regrets, or even to re-experience something. Maybe it's a happy moment, a moment where you felt full of possibility. I think it's a very normal human thing to think about the past. And I mean, and also it's because our memories are, we think of our brains as being very impressive, but actually we don't remember very much of anything. You think about how much sensory input is coming into your mind all the time and how little of it you actually retain. So I know it doesn't surprise me at all. It's a good thing that we can't, because of course, once the technology, I talk about this in the book, once the technology is available, it's just too seductive. Of course you want to go back. And it seems so clean in your mind. If I just did this, just this little thing, everything would be better. But of course, one of the themes of the book that, and it's something that I like to think about and got to explore in the book, is that idea of the accident. That idea that every time you invent a technology, you also invent the accident of that technology. There's no such thing as a car crash until you invent the car. There's no such thing as a plane crash until you invent the plane. Nuclear meltdowns don't exist until you invent nuclear power plants. And so, we see that the unintended consequences of technology we see around us all the time. And so part of it, the fun for me, is like, okay, so in a world where a prototype time machine does exist, well, what's the accident of that? And the answer is our crappy reality.
Well, and it's interesting because, in this study, when they actually asked people what they would do, people initially did that kind of cliched, I'd go back and kill Hitler. That was sort of and then when probed a bit more, people said, well, actually, I think I'd go back and I wouldn't have married that person, or I would have, it was like the tiny, like it was, they went from these sort of grandiose, sort of noble things to, I'd put my money on, like Daddy's baby and the fourth, right? Like people would go back and do things that either were for personal gain or like fix a small mistake. They weren't actually thinking I would prevent, the atomic bomb from being built.
Yeah, it's like my theory is that right now there's like a secret American prison where they're just putting all the time travelers that come back to try to get Trump. Like they're hiding them. They're like all in Guantanamo Bay, and there's just like all these time travelers from all these different eras, and they're just like shoving them there. They keep landing, and they just snatch them up before they can do anything. Yeah. It's actually a super good idea for a story. Nobody steal that.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. No, well, and that, of course, is a fundamental theme of the book, which is that, when Tom, and I don't want to give too much away, but like when Tom lands he's stranded in our version of reality, at first he's horrified by how like retrograde and kind of barbaric it seems compared to the version of the present that he's from. As he discovers these very unexpected versions of the people in his life, it gets more complicated. And not just his family, this woman he has this romantic connection with, but himself. He's a very different person. And that's the thing that we often leave out of these sort of time travel fantasies. If I could just go back and make this marry a different person, take that job in New York, or whatever it is, not get into the car that time when I had a car accident, whatever the situation is that you regret. We always imagine that, okay, we'd have a very different life, but we would be the same.
Yeah.
But why would you think that? But that's we have, our egos tell us that everything about us is essential to who we are. But of course, most of what makes your personality is a function of circumstance, your experience. And some of that stuff is outside of your control. Where your parents, who your parents are, what city you grew up in, what their jobs were, what economic class you were in, where you went to school, who your friends were. All these things impact who you are. And so you make this change. In the past, you think it's going to solve all your problems, but why do you think you'd be the same person? Why do you think everything else would change and you wouldn't? And so that's part of Tom's journey, is not just discovering these new versions of himself, but also of the people in his life, but also himself. And to tie into what you were saying, what I was interested in is throwing a character into a situation where he really does have to weigh the greater good of a world that is just objectively, things are better, versus his own personal happiness, satisfaction, sense of purpose and meaning. And that's very hard. I think most of us would find it really difficult to decide on the abstract, the better world versus on a very personal level, like the people in our lives, the connections that give our life meaning, and our own satisfaction and happiness.
Yeah. Well, and I think when you talked earlier about the hinge moment, I suspect a lot of us get it wrong when we pinpoint these moments and say, well, that was the moment that changed everything, or that was when my luck really turned, or even to assume, as Tom has to grapple with, coming from this more perfect world, which is maybe it's not about erasing your mistakes, but figuring out how to move forward from those mistakes. And how do you, it's not about sort of going back and saying, I'm going to go back the moment before I did that, did that really stupid thing, and rather think, okay, well, how do I move on from that stupid thing that I did? How do I build something from that?
Because we can't go back.
Yeah.
I mean, it's fun for storytelling, but all any of us can do is actually make better decisions moving forward.
Yeah.
And that's part of what he has to figure out in his own life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One of the other themes in the book is about the responsibility of people who create technology. And I think that, one of the things I think we're grappling with right now, and I think and I know that you weren't expecting perhaps the current political climate as you were.
Oh no, I predicted it all.
You predicted it all. Is the sense that our technology is, we hear this with, at Facebook, like is the technology neutral or not? Should Facebook take responsibility for the spread of fake news or not?
Yeah.
And one of the things that comes out in this contrast between the utopian world and then the world that's like ours, and even in our real world, is the idea that in the utopia, technology exists to create joy and ease, and it's in the service of the human beings.
Right.
I think for most of us, we often feel like we are the slaves to our technology, that sort of seems to be a common struggle that people have, or at least a common complaint that people have.
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to find the balance because I wanted to write a version of this world where the people actually live in. I mean, I think if you lived in a world with all this incredible technology, you wouldn't be like walking around all dazzled by it. It's like all of us carry around like a supercomputer in our back pocket. You don't like walk around staring at how amazing it is as you go down the street. You walk around staring at it because you're like, why is my Wi-Fi signal so bad? And like, why can't I log on? It's making me update the app. Like most of the time, no matter how incredible the technology is, we go from like, wow, that's so cool to like, why isn't this going faster very quickly? And so I did want, part of the, why I decided to write the book as a first person, in the first person as a first-person narrative, is because I didn't want him to be too giddy about it all.
Yeah.
I wanted it to be what would feel like realistic, which is if you lived in this world, you would take it all for granted, and you would take flying cars. Flying cars would be great up until the point where you're stuck in three-dimensional traffic, right? That's the kind of thing that I was interested in, and thinking about not just how cool it all is, but what would the actual implications be for you, And so, I find that, and so to me, it's like the character is taking a lot of things for granted in his life. There's the technology, there's the sort of the splendor and wonder of his society, but there's also the people in his life. Right?
Yeah.
He takes a lot of the ease, comfort, support that he has for granted until it's all peeled away.
Yeah.
Because fundamentally, while I love writing about technology and these ideas of utopia versus dystopia and the what ifs and alternate realities, this is fundamentally a story about people and what you can take away from people and have them still be who they are.
Yeah. Yeah. When you were creating this sort of utopia, futuristic world, is there anything that you think, that actually would be really cool? That would be the thing. Like, is there something that is your? Oh,
well, one of the things that there's this pharmaceutical patch that you can get, and when you go to like a cocktail function or a work function, it regulates your blood alcohol level, so you can set ahead of time how drunk you get. Would have solved so many problems in my life. So yeah, I really like that one. But as somebody who's chronically late, obviously teleportation would be. The thing about teleportation though, but again, it's like it's great. But then you think about it. Okay, so it's actually not that hard to take apart a person at an atomic level. It's super hard to put them back again in the right order. And then it's like, and actually the human body theoretically, like the nice thing about the human body is, so your body's made up of 37 trillion cells, each of which has a little tiny map of you in it, right? Your DNA. So a human body is made up of 37 trillion maps of yourself, but your clothes aren't. So does that mean like when you go to work, like you go naked and you have like an extra pair of clothes there, and like how does that work? And so of course I created this whole, that your clothes are created out of like a light sensitive liquid polymer that can be, ejected from a like a clothing recycler, right? But then that creates the question of like, okay, so then what would that do to fashion trends? If you could literally change your clothes any time of the day, would that mean that you'd have like these micro trends where like fads would happen? Like when you go to work, everyone's wearing hats, but when you like go to lunch, no one's wearing them anymore? Or like polka dots are cool in the morning, but they're like uncool by the afternoon? And so I like to think about that stuff, like what and how like frenetic that would feel if you like wanted to be stylish and like literally fashion. Like it's hard enough for me to keep up with fashion. I'm like, I don't know, is my tie skinny enough or tie's fatter this week? Like I don't know. But so the idea that okay, so first I think about teleporters, and then I think about, okay, so how would you have clothes? Okay, so you'd have these clothing recyclers, so then what would that do to fashion trends? And so what would that do to the fashion industry? Like, I like to think about that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And so those are sort of, now, welcome to a little insight into my brain. Now, of course, like, you don't want to overload the reader with that.
Yeah.
And at the same time, I always try to remember, like, this is a character who lives in that world. So if you were writing your life story, you wouldn't be like, and then I went downstairs and I turned on the coffee machine. Here's how coffee works. Well, you see, beans are grown in Yemen, and like this is how you don't explain every little thing. You don't explain how a microwave oven works just because you want to describe what you made for lunch that day. So I tried to find the balance of like this is interesting and cool and fun and sort of tells us something about this world. Both the obvious things, which is that, like life is so much easier, and so many of our like modern frustrations have been solved by technology. And then at the same time, like I did want to tell sort of subtle things, like this is, at its essence, sort of a consumerist utopia. Mm-hmm. The consumer is at the center of it. Everything is about your personal taste. Okay. That feels really good. If you're walking down the street and every billboard was literally about you, or like you could have like your clothes were like indexed to your own sort of whatever, your taste matrix. But then what would that do to storytelling? Like, would we still watch would we go to the movies? Would we read novels? Or would a different kind of storytelling develop? One that was all about like an interactive story that's only about your personal psychology. Okay, well, that sounds really cool. What if every story I read was just about me? But then what would that do to like, just sort of like a public culture? Mm-hmm. Would we all become much more selfish and self-attentive? And so those are the kind of questions I like to ask that are sort of, insidious is the wrong word, but I want to like also, while sort of optimistically praising all the positive things about it, to keep just sort of like saying like it's not like everything is perfect. There are little things going on, and this version of the world, like they don't have punk rock because what was there to complain about, right? But like, what would music today sound like without punk rock and hip hop?
Right. Yeah,
it would suck.
Right, right. So in a way then, if you talked about sort of this is getting sort of way down the rabbit hole, but
I think that like we've already
we're down, we're deep in that war, and this is Watership Down territory now. But if the 2016 in some ways is inspired by what the people in the 1950s thought we would be doing right now, how much does this version of kind of a future 2016 reflect your own anxieties, fears, critique of present day?
Well, I think that's part of the journey of the book, right? It is asking them fundamentally, and what the character kind of goes through is interrogating, like, what do we mean when we talk about the future we're supposed to have, personally, and also on a wider social, cultural, civilizational level. I don't know if civilizational is a word. Let's say it's a word.
It's a word.
So I wanted to kind of like ask those questions.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like, on the one hand, since 1965, like we've gone through profound social, cultural changes as a civilization, to the extent that humanity has anything kind of coherent and consistent about it. Certainly, if you're talking about North America. At the same time, I don't know that our imagination of the future has changed that much. I think that it's sometimes, like I think depending on who you are and on a sort of a wider level, it's definitely skewed, more cynical, darker. People are less convinced that technology is going to solve all our problems. It feels like things are getting increasingly dire, and people are anxious and full of dread. At the same time, like I don't know that our imagination of what the future is going to look like has really changed. Mm-hmm. And that's interesting to me, because what we sort of talked about before, as our ideas of the future, like our idea of the future is always about now, right? What we think the future is going to look like is always just a reflection of of the anxieties and hopes of the time. So what does it mean when we keep imagining these futures that were really rooted in a very specific post-war,
Yeah.
1950s
Yeah.
ideological perspective. Maybe it's time to come up with some new futures.
It's interesting because I was thinking about this with the release of Rogue One, of the offshoot of the Star Wars stories, and thinking about that universe compared to the Star Trek universe,
Right.
which was very much created as a utopia. I mean, it was very much created as a multiracial, diverse, pluralistic, peaceful society, which seems to go, and even with the reboot, seems
Right.
to go against a lot of the darker versions. So when I think about the new Star Wars movies, it's that is still a dark world with evil forces, and so you have these two kind of juggernaut franchises.
Well,
that
Star Wars,
present-
Star Wars, Star Trek as well, but Star Wars, and you see that with the new movies, it struggles with the fact that it was like this sort of 70s critique of empire now being created by one of the world's largest and most powerful and financially successful entertainment empires, right? And so it becomes this weird thing where like the system can only critique itself so much, and the contradictions of that become kind of funny. And so all they can, it's like, I enjoyed The Force Awakens, like I enjoy nostalgia. But at the same time, like that feeling you get where it's just like they can only tell, they can just retell the first story because it's hard for like the Disney Corporation to imagine an actual, authentic, modern critique of empire when they are
The empire.
The empire, right? Fortunately, the Third Reich did not triumph. But I wonder what their Star Wars would have looked like. The answer is probably Starship Troopers.
Nice.
Yeah, that's Star Wars or Star Trek was always a little like it has changed less because, and part of that is that idea, sort of what I was saying, that like this vision of what our far-flung future is going to look like hasn't actually it hasn't evolved that much. Compared to the major social and cultural changes, maybe more diverse faces are invited into our vision of the future. Maybe it's less. Even in Star Trek, like it was a whole bunch of dudes, and then they're like, oh, we should have like a black person and a woman. Well, let's make them one character.
Yeah.
I think the modern telling of that is it's getting better, right? But at the same time, I feel like Star Trek was always more like it was able to exist as a consumer product more because it was specifically a manifestation of a consumerist idea of the future.
Yeah.
It's about like I said, the equality of the consumer. If everybody's equal if you're buying something.
Yeah.
As long as you're paying for it.
I'm going to open it up to the audience in just a second. There's a mic there right in the center, so if you have a question and you want to make your way, that would be great. But the last
Also, if you want to freestyle rap, that would
Sure,
be...
anything, for sure. The last thing I wanted to ask, because I think about this in terms of when you were talking about, how we project into the future and how we think of ourselves in time. I know that you're a parent, and I'm a parent as well, and I certainly have had the experience
Different kids.
different kids, of having a child, in a way, helps you project into the future in that, my kid will live on in the world after I'm gone. And so when I imagine, what his future looks like, I don't want to get dark about it, obviously, because, and I'm wondering if your sense of time or future or hopefulness changed being a parent or seeing the world through your kids' eyes.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's a great question. I'll answer it twofold. For me, so I'm not giving anything too major away, the book, because this happens early on, but early on in the book, and it opens in this sort of techno-utopian version of the present, but the main character's mother dies quite suddenly, and that's something that I went through in my life. My mother passed away, it's like 16 years ago now, when I just turned 26, and it happened quite suddenly. And that was a real hinge moment in my life, and I can sort of see, not that everything changed overnight, but when I look back on it, that was the time when my life really changed its trajectory in a lot of different ways. And when you have kids, you start to reflect back on that stuff. So even though this is a very fun, very there's a lot of big plot twists, a lot of big character reveals, there's fun technology, it asks big kind of philosophical questions. It's a very entertaining, at times, I think, funny book.
It's great.
But on a very fun, well, thank you. It's great. On a fundamental level, I thought about this as a story about what happens when you lose a loved one, I mean, the character loses his mother, and he makes a series of not very good decisions. And a lot of those not very good decisions are about his specific character. They don't have anything to do with what he's gone through, but at the same time, he is grieving a fundamental loss. There's a limited number of people in your life who are going to love you unconditionally. And when you lose one of them, it throws you for a loop. And sometimes you don't notice it for a long time. In terms of the character, I always thought about him in the context of somebody who is grappling with grief and making decisions that he maybe wouldn't normally make, even though he would not describe it that way at the time. He would have all kinds of reasons why he's doing what he's doing. And because of my personality, I wasn't, this isn't like a depressing memoir about what it's like to deal with loss. But at the same time, that happened to me. And also, for the character, he hasn't really figured things out. And so when he loses his mother, it's that sense also she died not knowing if he was going to be okay, if he was going to get his life together. I was lucky. I even though my mother died quite quickly, we were able to have those conversations, and that I was able to kind of carry that, knowing that we had that sort of that when she died, it was knowing that I kind of figured out what I wanted to do. I wanted to write, that I was going to do it, that it was starting to happen for me, and that she could at least imagine what my future was going to look like. When you have kids, as I do now, you look back and you think about what had to happen for you to become the kind of person that was ready to be a parent. Not everybody is ready.
Yeah.
No, it's not always a choice. But when you have kids, you either grow up super fast, or you're going to make a lot of terrible mistakes. I mean, you're going to make mistakes anyways, but that's why they don't remember anything for the first 3 or 4 years. Amazing. Evolution is amazing. But when I was writing the book, I wanted to write a story about a character. It's a much more compressed time frame in my personal experience. What Tom goes through over the course of 6 weeks, I went through over the course of 10 years. But I want to tell a story about somebody who goes from losing one of the few people who's going to love him unconditionally to finding a new version of his life where there's a new family, a new balance, a new possibility for love. And even though that is just an undercurrent of the book, that was still the story, despite, because we all imagine what our future is going to look like, but none of us are living in, none of us get the future we thought we were going to have. You get the future you do have. And in a lot of ways, the sweep of history may carry you along, but what makes life worth living is the people in your life. And so as much as I love talking about the future, talking about technology, talking about the what-ifs of life, both philosophical and sort of, reality-based, I wanted to tell a story that kept grounding us in what gives life real purpose, which is us.
Thank you. Are there questions?
I have one.
Yeah, there's a mic right there.
Hi. So it sounds like you did a bit of research in doing your book, from what you had just said about the atoms and the breaking apart of people and trying to put them back together.
Right.
So that involved a little research, did it?
Yeah, I did do a lot of research. I find this stuff interesting in general. I like to know how things work. And so, my feeling was my job as a writer, whether it's researching the historical era of the 60s, or whether it's the psychology of the characters, or it's the science, my job as a writer is to understand this stuff as best as I can, to really kind of drill down. It's not to require the reader to wade through all that. My job is to figure out what is the most interesting thing about this, what's the best, what is useful for telling my story, and it's going to make you hopefully turn the pages even faster. So I don't put all my research in there, but I also think it's kind of how there is some, I think if you read the book, there is lots of interesting stuff in it. I do go into some of the background of things and some of the science, and I explain how things work, generally in a pretty casual way. But part of that is, I think it's how our brains work now. It's I think of it as wiki literature. There was a time when if you read something interesting in a book, you're oh, I got to put my book down and go to the reference library and sign a book out about it and find out how this works. Now you don't do that. You pick up your, people should still go to the reference library. This is an amazing facility. But you pick up your phone and you Google whatever, you Google how many cells are in the human body. And so I like to, when there was a moment where I hit the limits of my casual knowledge and I had to research, I would include some of my research in the book. So it's like, oh, if you're interested in this, I'm going to fill you in on some of the cool stuff here. If you want to go further, please do. You can go down a Google hole for a few days. I welcome that. But I like to kind of, my job is to sort of curate that information so it's not overwhelming for the reader either.
Right. So my question...
I never answered your question, did I? Okay. My actual question.
I wanted to kind of ask you that because I don't know if my question is something that's sort of appropriate or for the details of your book. But let's say into the future, you assume that people are going to be people still. However, we have, you've mentioned Star Wars and you mentioned Star Trek, and the idea of people looking like we do may not be the future, because we have cyborgs, people who are made up of different parts who come back from war and they put limbs on them that are mechanical or fiberglass or these different types of situations. So the idea of what a person is, because we also have the Clone Wars. So there are clones in theory, right? So the idea of walking around and there being clones, the idea of drones, because you mentioned Star Wars, the idea of what else is there? The Android market, of course, right? So the idea also of transportation, because as you had mentioned, there will be planes and perhaps they'll go between condos, and will be this whole little world like in some of these movies. But then it lends itself, what is a family?
It's like, what are curtains like in a world where there might be a car flying around outside your house?
Well, curtains and that kind of thing, sure. But I'm more interested in what is a unit? Because as you had said, your mother passed away.
Yeah.
Well, is there even a mother in the future? Is there a family unit? We have children. Do they in fact become a mixed mash of the environment that
So
they move?
I just want to make sure we get
There's a lot in that question, and I think it's an interesting
there
one.
is.
So I made a decision. So in my initial drafts, I actually did integrate a lot of like genetic engineering and biotechnology into this version of the world. But I made a decision.
What is that? What is biotechnology?
Oh, it's the integration of technology and organic matter.
But here's a question.
Sorry, I just want to make sure because there's another question after you. So.
Hey. Hi.
So I guess just to finish what I was saying, I made a decision though that this version of the future was going to be what I think of as a hard future, in that it was technology based, it was physically based. So you had like, for example, androids, robots. You had physical technology, but that it wasn't going to be a wet future, which was more.
Can I just ask you about that? Because once you have an android.
We have time for one more question, and I do want to get to the one behind you. So I'm so sorry, but we're just going to have to move on.
Anyways, I think that's super interesting, but I decided that wasn't what I was going to get into. Okay, well, it was nice talking to you.
Okay, just
Why did you come up with this situation? Like, why did you come up with this genre?
Oh, well, that's a very good question. Well, first of all, I find this stuff interesting. I noticed, I don't know if you have, there's a lot of talk of dystopia in our popular culture right now. And because of my own childhood interest, as I mentioned, in sort of utopian visions of the future that didn't happen, I like the idea of what somebody from my grandfather or my grandmother's generation how they would feel arriving in the present day, what it would seem like to them. And there's a novelist named Kurt Vonnegut, who was a big influence on me, who wrote in the 60s and 70s. Well, I mean, he continued to write after that. But he had a way of looking at the world around us with fresh eyes, with kind of describing in a very funny but also very compassionate way the things we take for granted around us. And I like the idea of looking at the world around us in a fresh way. And also I just like this stuff, And I think as a writer, you want to write the book. You want to write the books that you want to read. And so, I mean, when I started writing this book, I didn't have a book deal. I didn't have like a book agent. I was just interested in, I had this idea and I thought it would be the kind of book that I would want to read. And so I hope that there would be other people out there who would want to. I think as a writer, you sort of follow your own passions and taste. So the things that you love and that you love to read about, those are the things you should write about. But what makes it specific, what makes it different than all the other things you've read, is that it's you. And so you have to find your voice. You have to find your particular take on it. You have to find the thing the way of telling the story that only you would. And that's what makes that's what makes it different than the things you love. It makes it yours because it's your point of view. And that's not always easy to find, It can take a little while. But I think writing is a muscle like any other. You get better at it the more you do it. And so the more you do it, if you can... I think when you get started, sometimes you want to kind of mimic the people you love, and I think that that's fine. But as you get better as a writer, you find your specific way of seeing the world, and that is the thing that makes your work special and worth seeking out.
So is like the genre like a sci-fi fantasy or like a fantasy?
Yeah, it's science. It's science fiction, but it's very. I wanted to write a science fiction novel that if you were into sci-fi, you would find really interesting, but that if you don't think of yourself as a sci-fi person, you would still be really compelled by, because it's still very much grounded in real people, what this stuff feels like to a real person. The emotions are taken pretty seriously. So it's not like. It's kind of I would say it probably is in the middle of what you think of as general fiction and also like a science fiction. But yeah, I like that genre stuff. I think it's a lot of fun. I think it opens up interesting ways of talking about the world.
Can we have one more round of applause for these two?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah?
Thank you. Thank you so much. That was great.
Thank you very much.